Hello, my name is David Ferguson.
And I'm Sean Patterson, and we are the directors of Rewired Consulting.
We would like to welcome you to the Rewired Consultant podcast featuring guests from across the IT industry.
We will be talking to technology leaders from all over New Zealand, providing unique insight and good chat with the people on the front line of innovation and transformation.
This series will give you a great opportunity to hear the stories of the people involved and create the strategy and vision for some of New Zealand's most interesting businesses. This episode is sponsored by SmartSpace AI, the enterprise platform that reduces AI deployment time from months to minutes. With SmartSpace, you can start developing AI solutions immediately, thanks to our pre-built infrastructure. Our platform empowers you to build and deploy generative AI use cases without limitations, whether you're rapidly prototyping or scaling production use cases. Gain full control over AI models and resources while integrating seamlessly with your existing systems. Best of all, instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars building generative AI infrastructure from scratch, you can get started for as low as $400 a month. Ready to accelerate your AI journey and unlock new possibilities? Visit smartspace.ai or connect with us through the Azure Marketplace. SmartSpace AI, building insights, not infrastructure. Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the Rewired Consultant podcast with myself, David Ferguson, and my co-host, Sean Patterson. Today we are joined by Dr. Dani Chesson, who is the founder and director of the Design Thinker Institute. Originally from the United States, she is a multi-disciplinary practitioner who leverages human-centered design, behavioral science, and organizational development to help organizations get unstuck and drive impactful outcomes. She has worked with complex enterprise organizations across the USA and New Zealand, and her work focuses on helping HR, operational, and tech leaders prove tricky business challenges and drive impactful outcomes. Today, we're going to chat to Dani about her early career, how that led to New Zealand, the challenges and successes she had on that journey, the genesis and value proposition of the Design Thinker Institute, and talk about some trends and opportunities for 2025. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I am good. Thanks for having me here. It's always a little bit weird as a podcaster to be a guest on a podcast.
I know. That's the thing. And just a bit of history. We've been doing this podcast for just over a year now. And you've been running your own podcast with Peter Allen, doing the Design Thinker Institute podcast for probably a few years before that, and been quite successful. So I actually asked for your advice on how to set up a podcast and how to do it. And the advice that you gave me and gave myself and Sean led us to go on for it. And here we are a year later. So thanks for that.
Ta-da!
So look, let's get into things. We always like to go back and get a bit of a feel from where someone came from and their early career. You don't have to tell us everything, but just sort of give us a bit of a summary about how you started your career and how it sort of led to the type of work you're doing as well.
Cool. I won't tell you everything because it's a long story, and the punchline is my early career was a hot mess. And it was a hot mess because I just really struggled to find my path. So I not only dropped out of university once, but twice, simply because I felt like I was taking classes to take classes and I had no direction or vision or what am I doing with my life, until I found design. And when I found design, I felt like, the oceans parted and I just knew exactly what I was meant to be doing in life. Because design helped me to realize that what I really love from the time I was a little kid was I loved solving problems. And design was all about solving problems. And in design school, you learn how to solve problems. There's different mediums of how you solve problems, but at the crux of it, that's what design school is. So until I found design and design school, I just was a hot mess. And even though when I decided to go to design school, that wasn't the career choice that my parents wanted for me, but I think at that point, I'd taken them on such a roller coaster ride that they're like, just pick something.
But it's
So
funny you mention that. Yeah, it's funny you mention it because like at 18 years of age or 17 years of age, when you're forced with this decision to make, where do I want to go with my career? What do I want to do? You're too young. You don't have any experience. You don't know what you want to do. And a lot of people will just stick out at university for 3 or 4 years doing a degree, which doesn't really do anything for them. You know what I mean? But that is
I
the
was
way it
exactly
was.
the same. Yeah, I was exactly the same. I went to Edinburgh University because I was to study PE teaching because I was into sport and pretty good at sport. And then the career coach or career teacher was like, "Oh, you should go into PE teaching." I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess so." And then after a couple of years, I was like, "Man, this isn't for me," you know. So, at 18 or 19, 20, you really don't know a lot about the world, let alone what you want to do for the rest of your career.
nope,
Right?
nope. So I think the unfortunateness is that we are made to make these choices before we know who we are. And part of the reason we don't know who we are at that stage is because we haven't become anything yet, right? We're still figuring it out. I also think it's particularly complicated nowadays because you start university, and by the time you get out, the job that you were probably training to do probably doesn't even exist anymore. It's totally different from what you were trained to do. So I think this is getting more and more and more complex.
Yeah, and then moving into so you found your calling in the design space, and you found a design skill, and you were like, okay, this is for me. But obviously, there is different ways you can go from there. What was yeah? So like what was the shape of the path that you were going to go from there once you decided, yeah, this is definitely for me, but the way in which you were going to move forward.
So again, none of this was planned. I think a lot of things in life have to do with showing up and saying yes. And my moment in showing up and saying yes happens like this. One day I get a phone call from a recruiter, and the conversation went like this. This bank is really looking for somebody with visual design skills, and they're going through a lot of mergers, and they're having problems aligning their processes, and they want somebody to come in and visually display their business processes. I was a graphic designer, so I did branding and website work. So I'm sitting there like, huh? And I, at the time, had no idea what any of these words meant, but I was curious. I was also curious why somebody saw my resume or CV and thought, oh, she'd be great at this. So I said yes to the interview. I showed up at this interview, no idea what I'm doing, no idea what they're talking about. But what made it okay was the executive I was interviewing with basically said, we don't know what to do here. Right. And I remember thinking, well, if you don't know. But it made me curious about, okay, if this person doesn't know, well, maybe it's okay for me to not know, and maybe I can figure it out too. Yeah. And that started my career in banking. So I showed up in the banking world, knew nothing about banking. I had barely just had my own bank account, the one that your parents set up for you when you're a child. Like that was the extent of my banking knowledge. I think at the time I had just gotten like a debit card and I felt so grown up. So I showed up and I started doing this work. And basically what I was doing, even though it wasn't talked about at the time as this, was I was creating a service blueprint.
Yeah.
I was going around talking to all the teams that did the work. And I was going around and talking to the tech teams that, did the stuff behind the scenes or managed the platforms behind the scenes that helped make the work happen on the front end. And I was learning all of this stuff as I went. And I think one of the benefits I had was because I was a novice and I was in this environment where people were trying to figure things out, I was the dumb one in the room going, but why? Why does it happen that way? So, total 5-year-old moment on my part. And one thing led to another, and I went from doing process design work to leading more of technology changes. I did some training work, but I really started to fall in love with this idea of how do we help organizations change. So then I started to go more and more down that path. And that brought me back to my first love, which is problem solving. Because when you try to get humans to change, you run into a lot of challenges, and then that change in itself becomes a problem. So, what I love about this is that typically when you encounter a problem, that's a sign that something has to change, right? Because what you're doing isn't working. So that's problem number one. And then problem number two is how do we convince everybody else that we've got to change and then get them to do it? So that is, I felt like I found what I was meant to do.
That's awesome. And I suppose it gives you like, obviously just going back to your feeling like a 5-year-old in the room last night, but it gives you an opportunity to actually understand an organization from the inside out and really understand what everyone's challenges are instead of being siloed into what just your challenges. I suppose coming on to that as well is like like when you started your career and you were getting into this sort of work as well, the appetite for change and where that was coming from. Like, how did you find support from executives? And then obviously if you get a support from executives, you need support from the whole business. Like, how did you find those challenges?
So I entered financial services 2 years before the start of the GFC.
The fuse was lit.
And what happened when the GFC happened is all these new regulations had to come in. So in the US, the government had decided, okay, we've got to step in and we've got to do some stuff to really, keep the economy from crashing and burning any more than it was already. And that opened up pathways that required a lot of change. And a lot of the regulations that were coming out at the time was asking banks to do things that they were never designed to do. So not only was it regulatory change, it was process change, and it was technology change. The other thing that was happening at this time also in the US is that we were quickly moving to, online banking was the trend at the time. And we were quickly moving to mobile banking. Like, we could see that on the horizon, right? So I think in some ways the battle for change was the appetite for change at the executive level was a little bit easier because there were outside forces that were gearing this on. However, the boulder that I constantly found myself pushing was this. There was acknowledgement of change that was needed. There was investment. So we acknowledge change is needed. We're going to put aside some money to do this change. And then we go to do the change and nothing changes.
And what's the fact? What's the factors in that not changing? Is it like that's the interesting part, I would say.
So when I started my career, I thought the most difficult part of organizational change was technology. Yeah. And what I learned is actually technology changes really fast. The problem is that people don't change at the speed of technology.
Yeah.
And I think, fast forward to 2025 now, even today, and this problem has just kind of piled on, right? It's an exponential problem now, is that technology has continued to evolve and escalate faster and faster and faster. And we're still evolving at the pace that we were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that is the problem. It's getting humans to change is a very hard job.
Yeah.
Humans are creatures of habit, right? And they really struggle with that. I think bit off topic, but I'm listening to a thing called the chimp paradox at the moment. I don't know if you've heard of it. Have you heard of it, Dani? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting. Listen about that. There's many kind of themes in it, but one of them is, that behavioral change for humans is something that's just it's out with the norm for us, and for thousands of years that's been the case. So when humans come up against change or something that's not the norm, it can be it can be quite detrimental to them. You know what I mean? So I think that's and then when you're going through something like that in a big corporate organization with so many different layers and consequences, you're just adding on top of the stress levels, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I became really frustrated because I could not understand, why is it that we acknowledge the changes needed and then we set aside millions of dollars, millions, to do the change, and then it doesn't happen? Like, what a waste.
That must be quite frustrating as well, because that's like, you're all about change and you're looking at the design of that change and how it's all going to work, and then like how deflating is that when you put so much effort into it and then it doesn't go the way you want it to?
Yep. It's extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
But I'm also grateful for that frustration, because that frustration led to some curiosity, and the curiosity led me down a 10-year path of research, and I went back to school for a master's and then continued on to my PhD, because I just got to this point where I said, this is ridiculous. Like, there's got to be a better way. And it didn't also make sense to me that we can figure out how to send people into space. We can create these amazing little machines that we carry around in our pockets, but we can't change one little process. Like, how crazy is that?
I know.
So coming back, Sean, to the chimp paradox. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time studying is, so I went into this looking at it from a human behavior perspective, and which kind of led me to, well, behavior is driven by the brain, and all of those things. So fundamentally, why humans struggle with change has to do with our brain wiring. And I mentioned earlier, our brains don't evolve at the pace of technology. Like, it takes millennia to see differences in our brains, right? So what I have learned is that we have to just accept that our brain wiring naturally keeps us from, it's like, to our brain. So our brains crave stability and predictability, because back when we all lived on the savannah trying not to become lion food, change was a bad thing. So the more our environment was stable, the more likely we were going to live. But that same pattern of thinking still exists today. So if I wake up every morning and everything is the same, I go to the same job, I do the same thing over and over and over, this is safety, this is comfort. Now, it's a false sense of safety, but that is what our brains are wired to believe.
It's a really interesting listen. I'm only halfway through, but it's quite an eye opener when you really think about it, and the different themes and stuff that are involved in your subconscious thinking. And it's really interesting. So anyone who's watching or listening, I would recommend it, because it's very interesting and helps you think about things in a different light. And so obviously, Dani, I mean, you live in New Zealand now, and you've been here for a number of years. So what made you? Why New Zealand? What made you come here?
So part of my life plan, back when I was when I didn't know what I was going to do when I grew up, I did have this one thing that I knew I wanted to do, which is I wanted to live abroad. Didn't care where, I just wanted to have the experience of living somewhere else. So why New Zealand? Again, not planned. I have an uncle that has lived here most of his life, and as a wedding present from my husband and I, he got us plane tickets to come to New Zealand and stay at his home in Queenstown.
Wow.
And at the time, I know, really amazing.
Amazing. Yeah.
And at the time, I was hounding my husband about, like we had talked about this as a thing we were going to do before we got married. So it was one of my, non-negotiables. So when are we going to move? Where are we going to move? What are we going to do? And he was still very reserved about this idea, unsure about this idea. And then we came to visit New Zealand. And that decision, before we got, as we were boarding our flight to go back home, we had made the decision we're moving to New Zealand.
Nice. So you fell in love with New Zealand straight off the bat?
Well, for those of you that have not flown into Queenstown,
oh yeah.
if you don't fall in love with New Zealand when you see that, then you probably never will. And one of my criteria, so I grew up in New York City, and I wanted to also live somewhere. I wanted to live somewhere that was a very different experience, because to me, it didn't make sense to go through the effort of living somewhere else that would be very much the same.
Yeah.
And so New Zealand, it was far away. So if you're gonna do something, go all the way.
Tell us, well, that's the thing. There's no point in going to like London or something like that, where it's kind of the same big city, millions of people. Yeah. And when you came to New Zealand, and obviously you worked for a number of banks in New Zealand. So can you tell us a little bit maybe around the differences or any challenges you saw having worked back in the States compared to maybe banks in over here?
Before I say that, I will share this. So the same year that I finished my PhD, I moved to New Zealand, because, you can't just have one big thing happening in a year. And my thinking was, okay, I've got my PhD now. I'm moving to a new country. I'm going to do something totally different. Not going to work in banking anymore. And guess what?
Yeah.
My very first job in New Zealand was for Westpac.
Yeah. But it's a smaller market. That's the thing. There's not as much choice here. That's the thing that you probably found very quickly.
Yeah. So, Sean, getting to your question, some of the differences. So, the last company I worked at in the US was Bank of America. At the time that I had left Bank of America, it was a company of 150,000 people.
Wow.
The division of the bank that I worked in had more people than the 4 largest banks in New Zealand combined.
Yeah, so that gives you an idea of the scale. Yeah.
And if you're not familiar with the scale, let's say on average, the 4 banks in New Zealand have somewhere around 3,000 and 5,000 employees.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we took all those employees and lumped them together, it barely made one division of Bank of America.
Did you come up against the same challenges, though, as you had in America? Because obviously there's a scale difference, but then in terms of the challenges of the work you do, and then obviously like not the seeing through of the change, you know what I mean? Was that pretty evident early in your New Zealand career as well?
Oh, yeah. So something that was really interesting in moving to New Zealand is, one, I noticed the difference. Everything in New Zealand felt like I've done this before. And then I realized, I think New Zealand is about a decade behind. Like everything hits New Zealand a little bit late. And I'm not saying that New Zealand is, I think it's a distance thing, not a we're just waiting around. Like by the time, and we see this in like economic patterns, right? We see something happening in the US or the UK, and it doesn't hit New Zealand till about 18 months later.
Yeah.
And so this same pattern I was seeing in like technology challenges or regular. So my very first project that I worked on in New Zealand was a regulatory project. And it was something that I had done about 8 years ago in the US.
Yeah.
So there's a lag in things happening. I also experienced some of, in moving to New Zealand and looking for work, I got a lot of, but you don't have any New Zealand experience, which I have learned since that every single person that has moved to New Zealand has been told this.
Yeah.
And at the time, to me, it felt really odd because it felt like I was being told the fact that you've worked for one of the biggest banks in the world in one of the biggest economies in the world doesn't help here, which to me, my brain just couldn't make sense of.
Yeah.
I think that's still the case as well, Danny. Trying to change that mindset. I mean, that was a few years ago, and it still seems as though that's the case. And I mean, me and David over the last 12, 18 months have seen the number of applications or the number of people on the market has just skyrocketed. So, and that's people who are in New Zealand and aren't able to lock in a job. So people from overseas who haven't got the New Zealand experience. I mean, it's almost an impossible task to get a job at the moment. So there seems to still be a long way to go before we can kind of bridge that gap. As you said, when you've worked for one of the biggest banks in the world and one of the biggest economies, for then it not to be able to translate to over here is something that we really need to, I think, work on, right?
I think there's very much a mentality that if it's not from here, it won't work here, or it's not good enough to be here kind of thinking.
Do you think as well, I don't know, something that they would think is like, obviously Kiwis are big on the kind of culture aspect and the ways of working, and they think maybe the work that's how they work in the States and how they work in New Zealand is completely different. So, people will find a challenge with that. But is that something that you would think could be one of the reasons why?
So yes, there are cultural differences, and so for example, in all the years that I worked in U.S. banking, a suit was the attire, right?
Yeah.
Like I have very few professional experiences in my U.S. career that I was not wearing a suit of some sort.
Yeah.
Well, you show up in a suit in New Zealand, and people either think you're somebody really, really important,
Yeah.
or they kind of look at you funny.
Yeah. Yeah, they actually do. Like, you would never see someone down Britomart with where Westpac and stuff is in a suit. Just doesn't happen anymore.
It doesn't. So I have a closet full of custom made business suits that I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with them. So
Well, sometimes it comes round in circles, so you never know. In 10 years' time, the suit might be back in. So maybe just hold on to them for the time being.
So that's what they're doing at the moment. The other thing that I noticed, another big difference is the amount of time off that New Zealanders get. So typically in the US, you're guaranteed for a full-time position, what your employer has to give you in terms of leave is 2 weeks.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
In New Zealand, that's 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Plus all your stat days.
Plus all your stat days. And in New Zealand, and for those that don't know what stat days are, those are public holidays, right?
Yeah.
So in the States, we get somewhere, depending on what state you're in, you get somewhere between 8 and 10 public holidays.
Okay.
But in New Zealand, it's a bit more.
Yeah.
The other big difference is that in the US, your access to healthcare is tied to your employer.
Yeah.
So part of your benefit package is that your employer pays some of your health insurance costs, and you pay the other half. And it is expensive.
Yeah.
And so for scale size, so at the time that I left, for my husband and I, two relatively young, healthy people, we were spending about $12,000 US a year in monthly premiums plus a $5,000 access.
Wow. Okay. That's
US
crazy.
dollars, as you
Yeah.
said, right? So that's a lot of money.
Yes. Whereas in New Zealand, to cover two relatively young people, we're paying somewhere around $380.
Yeah. That's that's a big difference. And I suppose like those are the sort of changes from like obviously from the health insurance side of things, the leave and all that sort of stuff. But obviously started out with Westpac, and then you worked for a few different businesses then after that as well.
Yeah.
Did you see similar trends in terms of how they worked, or were they quite different sort of beasts in terms of what you find?
The other thing that I'll touch on before we move on is that in the US, your healthcare is tied to your employer, which makes changing jobs really tricky.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What I've learned in New Zealand is that because it's not tied, you can go out contracting. It's much easier for you to start a business because you're not depending on an employer to support you with your healthcare costs.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting. Yeah.
Didn't know that. Yeah.
So it gives your career a lot more opportunity. So I know that I've mentioned a lot of down things about New Zealand. That is a big, big benefit.
Yeah.
So, sorry, David, the other question was...
Yeah, it was just, because then obviously over the next few years, you'd worked in, like obviously looking through your history, you'd worked in a few different organizations, and I'm assuming along the way you've seen similar sort of challenges, maybe similar frustrations and stuff like that, because obviously you worked in a few businesses and then it gave you the idea to obviously go out and do your own thing. But those all are experiences. Like, could you sort of share a bit of information on those?
Yeah. So I just found myself in this point that I just kept going from bank to bank I did steer away from bank and go into insurance, which is completely different. So, and I was seeing the same kinds of problems, right? And what I was getting frustrated with at the time was everybody was talking about innovation and the need to move at pace and all of, they were saying all the words that made me really happy and excited about work, but none of those things were happening. Yeah. And again, I found myself thinking, I just want to do something different. I was also getting to this point in my career where I felt like, okay, I've climbed the corporate ladder. I know what this is about. I've done this now at several big organizations. Like, what am I doing with my life? I felt like the 19-year-old again, like trying to figure it out. And I had decided I wanted to go out on my own, and I wanted to build a business around helping companies solve problems.
Yeah.
That was the extent of my vision.
And then the timing, and obviously having, like, the thing about it, because we've been through a similar thing as well in terms of like why we started Rewired, but the timing, and then it's just obviously having, you have to have the confidence and obviously the willing, just the action to go and do it. Like, how did the timing and how did you because that was your vision, but timing and actually going out and doing it's a different thing,
So I had the idea, and then I decided, I was like on the fence, right? And I decided I'm just going to go out and talk to some people. And I had this, I want to say, life-changing conversation with Kimball. So Kimball, if you're listening, thanks. And Kimball said to me, "You have a PhD, for God's sake. You've been researching this for 10 years. If you can't go out and start a business, then what the hell are the rest of us doing?"
Good point. Got a point. Good point, yeah.
And then I was sitting there, well, you're right, but the one with the PhD didn't come to that conclusion. But that was really where I started thinking, okay, I've got to
Yeah.
You know, I've invested so much time and energy and money into doing this research work. What am I doing with it? And if I want to have a bigger impact, and if I wanted to, and that was another thing, it's that I feel very fortunate to live in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And I know that the start of this call, I was, this podcast, I was complaining a lot about it, but it is an amazing place to live. And I want to have an impact. Like, I don't want to be somebody that lives in New Zealand to take up space in New Zealand and add to the population count. So there's a better balance of sheep and people. I want to actually do something and impact and make New Zealand better, right? Make New Zealand a first world leading cutting edge country. Well, New Zealand is always also a first world country, but you know what I mean? I want it to be this amazing place that people want to move to and people know about. And so that was also a driving factor in this.
As a small business as well, I think New Zealand is a good place to start a business, and you can do well without having like a big name and a big business behind you, because Kiwis are great in the sense that if you deliver for them, they don't care whether it's a Fortune 500 business or a big name. They care about how you deliver for them and the individual you are. And it means you can, and we find that ourselves as a small business running 4 years now. We probably wouldn't have done it if we were living in Edinburgh, if we were living in Dublin, or you probably wouldn't have done it if you're living in New York, because it just would have been too hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, and what I find is that you go out and talk to one person here, and next thing you know, you're having conversations with 10 people that have never met, that you never knew before. And you do something really wonderful for one person, and they tell everybody they know. So this can also work against you, right? Because if you do something bad, everybody will know.
That's exactly what we were talking about earlier. Look, just for our listeners who, like, this is a chance for you just to plug exactly what you do and what your value proposition is. Could you give us a bit of a summary around like what your business is and what it does? And then we can talk a little bit around maybe some success stories that you've had so far. If that's okay.
Yeah. So explaining what I do is a little bit tricky, because at the core of what I do is I work with leaders who have either basically been stuck, right? They're seeing the same problem just coming back over and over again, and they're just not being able to cut through. And that could be like process related things, technology related things, people related things. And what I work with leaders and their teams is really, let's break through that cycle. Let's come up with and think about, how do we actually solve this in a way that will lift, elevate, and have some impact and won't come back again.
Yeah.
And if it does come back again, it's going to come back in a different way because something else has changed. So that is what I do.
Is that Dani? Is that like for, would you say most of the sort of clients or the businesses you work with are businesses that are bigger corporates where they have maybe layers of management, and you're helping them cut through those, not cut through the layers, but be able to solve the problem within the bigger organizations with more people and maybe more issues to solve? Would that be fair to say?
I don't know if that is fair to say, because my career has all been in larger size businesses. Yeah. And I think because of that, I tend to be like, that's just the circle that I'm exposed to. So because I've worked for large organizations, I tend to get work in large organizations. Yeah. So I can't really answer that question fairly, because I don't know if.
Because other businesses, regardless of the size, would still likely have similar issues. It doesn't matter if it's a business with 20 people or 20,000, right? Those issues that you can help resolve could be there.
Yeah, because what I do is scalable, right? So the challenges that organizations face, whether it's inefficient processes or lagging technology or an adoption issue or people performance issue, those exist at every single level. It's just the scale that is different.
Yeah. Could you give us an example then of maybe a piece of work that you've been working on through your time at the Design Think Institute that you're really, really proud of, that showcases obviously really well what you've just said in terms of what the business does?
Sure. Well, I'll talk about this one because it's freshly top of mind at the moment, because this piece of work that I helped out on won the New Zealand HR Award for Future of Work.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Not my win, it was the team's win, but it was a piece of work that I'm really, really proud of. And the piece of work was, so I partnered with a leader at Fonterra, Susie Lusham, and she had approached me some years ago, frustrated because they had all of these things that needed to be fixed urgently and just really struggling to get momentum and moving forward. And she came to me and she said, I have this idea of a SWAT team, and I want to bring in some principles and practices from Agile, some things from design thinking, and some things from behavioral science, and have this team, like a SWAT team, go in and attack the problem. But I don't know how to get that to happen. And she asked me, well, is that something you can help with? And I said, I don't know how we could do this, but let's go find out. This is where being curious sometimes just leads to amazing things, right? And so we did.
Yeah.
And we took this idea and really looked at how can we enable a team to deliver change at pace.
Yeah.
And within about 12 weeks, we were able to actually deliver some very, very impactful outcomes for the organization. And then we decided, or Susie decided, well, how do we know this wasn't like a one-hit wonder? And so then that was repeated 2 more times and got similar business results. So that is a piece of work that I'm really proud of.
Yeah.
Because it came from this place of curiosity. Again, another leader saying to me, I don't know. And I think that's also an example for any leaders that are out there listening to this. Say I don't know more often, because I think that will really drive some very innovative, creative thinking from your teams.
Yeah. Because sometimes if it's, I don't know, this is the too hard bucket, then it just gets left instead of actually, as you say, having the curiosity to delve into it and seeing what can be done and realizing things can be done. So that's good. And that's obviously an example of a large organization that you've done some great work with in New Zealand. Coming back onto the question that Sean had about like those smaller businesses, and actually like is that something that you're going to actively target now, or is there businesses that you would want to, like, who are going through different challenges that you think could be worth reaching out to you? Like how are you sort of targeting those businesses?
So I think I am open to, I'm not a only big business person. I think one of the amazing things about New Zealand is the number of small businesses and startups that exist in New Zealand. One of my things that I would love to help an organization with, because I think one of the opportunities for New Zealand is to become, like, New Zealand has an amazing opportunity to launch global businesses, particularly in the tech space. We're far away. So, being far away means that sometimes physical goods is not a profitable business. But I think in the tech and knowledge workspace, there's a huge opportunity in New Zealand. And that is a space that I would love to figure out how to work in and help.
Nice.
So that's one of my next aspiration, if you will.
Cool.
Well, and looking forward, obviously, with a lot of businesses, a lot of companies went through massive restructures, redundancies, and stuff like that. Dani, I'm sure you're aware of in New Zealand. So what do you see in your line of work? What do you see 2025 looking like?
So I actually think New Zealand is going to end up with another labor shortage crisis, and probably even bigger than what we saw post-COVID. the down, one of the biggest impacts of the current state of the economy here is that we have and continue to lose a lot of skilled, talented people. Australia is recruiting in New Zealand so hard.
Yeah. And it's not even just people going on their OE anymore. It's like proper like professionals who've got a lot of skin in the game are leaving New Zealand because the opportunity, salaries, lifestyle at the moment. And it's a shame to say that because we know how good the lifestyle is here in New Zealand, but there's definitely a trick being missed, isn't there?
There absolutely is, and we're not doing enough to keep people here. And you're right. Like, it used to be that people left New Zealand to do their OE, and they'd get all this really great experience elsewhere, and then come back and set up their lives. But I am seeing people with like families that have bought homes and pretty settled in their lives, going, actually, I'm leaving. And I'm moving my family. And so which is a real shame, because then what's happening is the people that are leaving are unlikely to come back, because they're not, it's very different if you're 20 and you go somewhere to move back because you don't have as much life to move.
Yeah.
Whereas, now you've moved and your kids are settled, you've bought a new house, you've probably further along in your career now. That's a harder move.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of the impact on your work and how you're dealing with different challenges, because this is going to be front of mind for obviously organizations now who know that they're going to have to scale their business in different parts and stuff like that. Do you use that as very much of a sort of like, in terms of like how their processes are around maybe recruitment or looking forward, resources, pipeline and stuff like that? Is that playing a big part in some of the conversations you're having?
So I think while the economy is low, this gives companies an opportunity to think about, because we know the economy happens in cycles, right? We happen to be in a low one, and at some point it's going to be. So for me, when the economy is low, it's like your prep time, it's training time, right? This is the time. So if you're into sports, this is the time you're hitting the gym and working on all the little tweaks and building the muscle. This is the time you need to be doing that. So I think this is the time where we could be very purposeful about, where's this organization going? We know that we're going to be facing a talent shortage. So how do we redesign our processes? How do we redesign our jobs to make it more appealing? What are we doing about AI? So this is the time to really be thinking about that, and thinking about, how do we become smarter organizations? How do we become 21st century organizations? This is the time to be doing that.
Okay, interesting. All right. Yeah. Look. Well, I think I think we'll leave it there. Dani, that was a really interesting chat. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed getting to know about your business a bit more as well. If any businesses out there or any individuals want more information on the Design Thinker Institute, the website is www.designthinkerinstitute.com. Is that right, Dani? Yeah.
That is correct.
Just double checking that was right. So, and generally, how people engage with you, if they were to reach out to you, is it normally by email, or is it by LinkedIn, or like if someone was looking to engage with you, what's the best way to do it?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me there, or just shoot me an email at dani@designthinkerinstitute.com.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, look, to our listeners, thanks very much for listening and watching the podcast now on our YouTube channel. If you can help us out and subscribe, that would be fantastic. And we'll see you for the next podcast. Thanks very much again, Dr. Dani Chesson.
Thanks, David and Sean.
Done.
Woo!